Sergeant Franklin Miles was in a trench in Normandy, June 1944, after failing his third consecutive mission. His hands trembled, his breathing was rapid, and his mind was stuck in a loop, replaying every mistake he had made. First mission, he hesitated for 2 seconds and his platoon came under fire. Second mission, he made the wrong decision that cost him position. Third mission, he repeated the mistake because his mind was busy ruminating on past errors instead of focusing on the present. And the commander told him a brutal truth, that Miles wasn't failing because of a lack of skill. He was failing because he had a mental habit of ruminating on past failures instead of processing tactically and moving forward. And that habit was killing soldiers. His nephew found these words written in a diary, hidden in a locked drawer of an old desk, discovered only by forcing the lock after Miles' death in 2011. 46 pages, dated June to July 1944, documenting how the habit of ruminating on past failures created a cycle of future failures, and how a brutal shift from processing to ruminating transformed failure into execution. What exactly was this habit? How did Miles break the cycle? You'll discover why a soldier who ruminates on past failure guarantees future failure, and how tactical processing eliminates the loop that keeps you failing repeatedly. Sergeant Franklin Miles's nephew was emptying the office of the old Vermont house in August 2011, 9 months after the funeral. Miles had died at 90, taking with him 67 years of almost complete silence about 2 specific weeks in June 1944, where he failed in 3 consecutive missions. 2 weeks where he discovered he was trapped in a brutal cycle of failure because he ruminated on failures instead of processing them tactically. When his nephew tried to open a locked drawer in an old desk, he realized the key had been lost decades ago. He forced the lock with a screwdriver. Inside, he found a small diary with a worn leather cover. The first words on the first page made him stop breathing. Miles had written that he was on his 3rd consecutive failed mission, that his mind was stuck in a loop, ruminating on each mistake, and that this mental habit of constantly replaying past failures was guaranteeing future failures because his mind wasn't present in the current mission. The nephew read every word on those 46 pages with a growing sense of discovering an uncle completely different from the confident veteran he had known. The Miles he had known was decisive. He executed without hesitation. He rarely made mistakes. But those pages revealed that Miles had been exactly the opposite in June 1944. He had been a soldier trapped in a cycle of failures because each failure fueled a mental habit of rumination that guaranteed the next failure. In the following pages, Miles described a devastating pattern. First mission, he hesitated on a critical decision. The platoon took unnecessary fire, and after the mission, his mind was stuck replaying those 2 seconds of hesitation repeatedly, analyzing what he should have done, imagining alternative scenarios, and that rumination consumed mental energy that should have been used to prepare for the next mission. The second mission arrived with his mind still ruminating on the first failure, and because his mind was occupied with the past, he wasn't fully present in the present. He made a wrong decision that cost him a defensive position. And after the second failure, his mind had 2 loops of rumination running simultaneously: replay of the first failure, replay of the second failure, and 0 mental energy to process tactically or prepare for the third mission. The third mission was a complete disaster. Miles was mentally paralyzed by rumination over 2 previous failures. Every decision was tainted by a mental replay of past mistakes, and he made mistake after mistake because his mind wasn't operating in the present. It was stuck in a past he couldn't change. The nephew realized as he read that those pages weren't just about military warfare. They were about why people get stuck in a cycle of repeated failure, because each failure fuels the mental habit of rumination, and rumination consumes energy that should be spent processing tactics and preparing for the next attempt. Miles had discovered that a soldier who ruminates on past failure guarantees future failure. If you're listening to this now, don't abandon Sergeant Franklin Miles at this point. If you're stuck in a brutal cycle of 3 consecutive failures, discovering that the mental habit of ruminating on past mistakes is guaranteeing future errors. Leave a like as a soldier who recognizes that you too ruminate on failures instead of processing them tactically, because the next 2 weeks will reveal how to break the cycle that keeps you failing repeatedly. Miles wrote that after a third consecutive failure, his commander sat beside him in the trench and asked what was going on. Miles explained that he was mentally replaying each mistake, trying to understand where he had failed, analyzing what he should have done differently. And the commander told him the brutal truth that this wasn't tactical analysis, it was destructive rumination. And the difference between the two determined whether a soldier learned from failure or remained trapped in a cycle of repeated failures. He described how the commander explained mechanics. Tactical analysis processed a failure once. It identified a specific error. It extracted a clear lesson, and it filed it away. It took perhaps 15 minutes. And then the mind was free to focus on the present and prepare for the next mission. Rumination endlessly replayed the failure, without extracting a new lesson, just an emotional replay of what went wrong. And it consumed mental energy for hours or days. Miles recognized the pattern immediately. He had replayed the first mistake hundreds of times. And each replay was identical, the same 2 seconds of hesitation, the same imagined scenario of what he should have done, the same feeling of regret. He wasn't learning anything new after the first replay, but his mind kept looping as if the next replay would reveal something different. That revealed the truth about why rumination perpetuates a cycle of failure, because rumination consumes mental energy that should be present. Miles calculated that he spent perhaps 4 hours a day ruminating on past failures. 4 hours where his mind wasn't processing the current situation. It wasn't preparing for the next mission. It was stuck in a past he couldn't change. And those 4 hours of mental absence ensured that the next mission would be executed at a fraction of its capacity. The commander said he had seen the pattern dozens of times. The soldier would fail. He would start ruminating. Rumination consumed mental energy, and with reduced mental energy, the soldier would fail the next mission, which created more material to ruminate on, and the cycle intensified until the soldier was completely paralyzed by loops of rumination about multiple accumulated failures. Miles documented that he recognized exactly that cycle in himself. First failure had created a rumination loop that consumed perhaps 20% of his mental energy. Second failure created a second loop, and now he was operating at perhaps 50% of his mental capacity, because half was stuck ruminating on failures he couldn't change, and with only half his capacity available, a third failure had been inevitable. The commander explained that the critical difference was time. Tactical analysis processed failures completely in 15 minutes and freed the mind. Rumination ran indefinitely without ever fully processing anything, and while the rumination loop was active, the mind wasn't fully present to execute. It was divided between the present and an endless replay of the past. Miles realized a devastating truth. He wasn't failing because he was incompetent. He was failing because the habit of ruminating on past failures ensured he would never have the full mental capacity available for the next attempt. And without full capacity, failure was practically guaranteed. This fueled more rumination, and the cycle continued until a forced break or change of habit occurred. Miles wrote that the commander taught a brutal protocol for breaking the rumination cycle. He said he had 15 minutes immediately after a failure to process it tactically. Not 15 minutes when he felt like it. Not 15 minutes when he was emotionally ready. 15 minutes forced within an hour of the failure. And after those 15 minutes, the loop was closed. The failure was filed away, and the mind was forced to return to the present. He described a specific protocol that the commander required. First, identify the exact error in one sentence, not a complete story of everything that went wrong. One sentence describing the central error. Second, extract a specific lesson about what to do differently, not a vague analysis of what to do differently. A concrete and applicable lesson. Third, mentally file it away with a conscious decision that processing was complete. And fourth, each time the mind tried to reopen the rumination loop, acknowledge that the failure had already been processed and force attention back to the present. Miles applied the protocol that same night. He processed the first failure. The central error was hesitation in assessing the scenario twice instead of trusting the first assessment. The lesson was to trust the first tactical assessment and execute immediately. He filed it away, and when his mind tried to reopen the rumination loop an hour later, he recognized that the failure had already been processed. He forced his attention back to preparing for the next mission. Mind resisted brutally. He offered dozens of reasons to continue. Ruminating, saying he needed to analyze more, that there were details he hadn't processed, that another replay would reveal something important. But Miles enforced protocol. Each time Mind tried to reopen the loop, he recognized that processing was complete and redirected attention to the present. That revealed a fundamental difference between processing and ruminating. Processing had a clear endpoint: 15 minutes. Lesson learned, filed away. Rumination had no endpoint. It ran indefinitely, because it never established that processing was complete. The mind kept going over it, assuming that the next replay would reveal something new, and it never did. Miles documented that in the following days, he processed the second and third failures using the same protocol. 15 minutes each, error identified, lesson learned, filed away. And then he forced his mind to stop ruminating each time he tried to reopen loops. It was a brutal battle against a rumination habit he had developed over years. But he maintained the protocol. The difference was immediate and measurable. Instead of spending 4 hours a day ruminating on failures, he spent 45 minutes processing tactically, and the rest of his mental energy was available to be present, to process the current situation, to prepare for the next mission. And with full mental capacity available, execution improved dramatically. The commander had explained that most soldiers never learned distinction. They confused rumination with learning. They thought that the more time they spent reviewing failures, the more they would learn. But the truth was the opposite. Rumination taught nothing after the first processing. It only consumed energy that should have been present. And it ensured that the next attempt would be executed with reduced capacity because the mind was divided between the present and an endless replay of the past. Miles wrote that the real test of the protocol came on the fourth mission, 5 days after. The commander taught him the difference between processing and ruminating. The mission was reconnaissance of German positions in a village, exactly the type of operation where he had failed before. And for the first time in weeks, his mind was completely present. There were no loops of rumination running in the background consuming mental energy. He had processed 3 previous failures tactically, filed away, and 100% of his capacity was available to focus on the current mission. He described an immediate difference in execution. In previous missions, part of his mind was always divided, trying to focus on the present but constantly pulled back to replays of past failures, like trying to execute a complex task while someone is whispering in his ear about mistakes he made yesterday. But in the fourth mission, that replay voice was silenced. His mind was fully present, processing the situation in real time. Miles completed the reconnaissance without significant error. It wasn't perfect. He made a small navigational mistake that he quickly corrected, but the critical difference was that after the mission, he processed that error tactically. 15 minutes. Error identified. Lesson learned. Filed away. And he refused to allow his mind to enter a rumination loop. Every time his mind tried to revisit the error, he recognized that processing was complete and forced his attention back to the present. That revealed a fundamental transformation. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about not allowing past mistakes to consume present mental energy. Miles would continue to make mistakes occasionally, but now he had a protocol for processing mistakes without getting stuck in a cycle of rumination that guaranteed more future errors. In the following weeks, Miles executed a dozen missions with a success rate that transformed his reputation from a soldier who repeatedly failed to a reliable one. And the difference wasn't improved technical skill, it was mental availability. He was performing at 100% capacity because 0% was stuck ruminating on failures he couldn't change. He documented that other soldiers noticed the transformation. They asked what had changed, and Miles explained the protocol, that the difference between failing repeatedly and performing consistently was a matter of mental habit. Rumination kept the soldier trapped in a cycle of failure. Tactical processing freed the soldier to be present and perform at full capacity. The commander confirmed the transformation after the 6th successful mission. He said that Miles had broken the cycle that destroyed most soldiers who began to fail, that most got stuck in a spiral of failure, leading to rumination, leading to more failure. And only soldiers who learned to process tactically instead of ruminating were able to break the spiral and return to effective execution. Miles wrote that critical lessons weren't about avoiding failure. They were about changing the relationship with failure. Failure processed tactically was a filed lesson that improved future performance. Failure ruminated on was a mental loop that consumed energy and guaranteed future failures. And the choice between processing and ruminating determined whether the soldier learned and improved or remained stuck failing repeatedly. Sergeant Franklin Miles is breaking a cycle of 3 consecutive failures through a protocol of tactical processing instead of ruminating, freeing his mind to be fully present and perform at full capacity. If you want to witness how a change in mental habits transformed a failing soldier into a reliable one, subscribe to this channel now and follow along as he applies a protocol that eliminates destructive rumination, because upcoming topics will reveal how to apply tactical processing outside of the battlefield. Miles wrote that in the weeks following the cycle of failures, he observed a devastating pattern in other soldiers. He saw in their eyes the same rumination that had almost destroyed him. Soldiers who made mistakes and remained stuck mentally replaying them for days. And when Miles tried to teach them tactical processing protocols, most resisted. They said they needed to fully understand what went wrong. That 15 minutes wasn't enough. That stopping thinking about the mistake seemed negligent. He described a specific soldier named Cooper who had failed a mission and had been ruminating for 3 days. Cooper mentally replayed the mistake perhaps 50 times a day, and each time Miles suggested processing it tactically and filing it away, Cooper said he was still learning from the mistake, that each replay revealed a new detail, that he needed to keep analyzing it until he understood it perfectly. Miles recognized why he had thought exactly that way. He had confused rumination with learning. He had assumed that the more time he spent thinking about a mistake, the more he would learn. But the truth was that learning happened in the first processing, identifying the mistake, extracting the lesson, and after that, each additional replay taught nothing new. It only reinforced negative emotion and consumed mental energy. That revealed an illusion that kept people trapped in a cycle of rumination. That rumination seemed productive. It seemed like learning, because the mind was busy processing something. But processing without an endpoint wasn't learning. It was a destructive loop disguised as analysis. True learning extracted the lesson and moved on. Rumination endlessly repeated the process without ever moving forward. Miles tried to explain to Cooper using numbers. He asked how many times he had reviewed the error in the last 3 days. Cooper estimated perhaps 150 times. Miles asked what he had learned in replay number 150 that he didn't know in replay number 5. Cooper remained silent, because the answer was nothing. The first 5 replays had identified the error and the lesson. The following 145 replays were just emotional rumination. Cooper resisted admitting it, because admitting it meant acknowledging that he had wasted 3 days on mental activity that taught him nothing, that he had consumed energy that should have been spent preparing for the next mission, and that this choice to continue ruminating practically guaranteed that the next mission would be executed at a reduced capacity. Miles documented that he saw the pattern repeat dozens of times. The soldier would fail. He would start ruminating. He would confuse rumination with learning. He would justify continuing to ruminate by saying he was processing, and he would get stuck in a loop that consumed energy and guaranteed the next failure. And when the next failure happened, the soldier had more material to ruminate on, and the cycle intensified. The difference between soldiers who improved after failure and soldiers who got stuck failing was a matter of mental habit. Soldiers who improved processed tactically. 15 minutes, lesson learned, filed away, and they returned to the present with 100% of their capacity available. Soldiers who got stuck ruminated for days. They confused mental activity with learning, and they operated at reduced capacity because a significant part of their mind was stuck in an endless replay of the past. Miles wrote that the most brutal discovery about rumination was that the mind never closes a loop voluntarily, that if you wait to feel you've processed enough before filing away a failure, You never will, because the mind will always find a reason for another replay. It will always suggest that there's a detail it hasn't yet processed, and it will use that justification to keep the loop open indefinitely, consuming energy that should be present. He described how he tested it experimentally. After tactically processing the failure in 15 minutes, he waited to see if the mind would voluntarily stop trying to reopen the loop, and the mind didn't stop. 2 hours later, he offered to repeat the error once more. 6 hours later, he offered it again. The next day, he kept offering it, and each offer came with a justification that seemed reasonable, that there was an angle he hadn't considered. That further analysis would reveal important insight. Miles realized that if he had waited for mind to signal that processing was complete before closing the loop would never have closed, because mind had no internal mechanism to determine when analysis was sufficient. It just kept offering replay indefinitely. And the only way to close the loop was a forced decision that processing was complete, regardless of what mind suggested. That revealed why most people get stuck ruminating for days or weeks after a failure, because they expect to feel like they've finished processing it before moving on, and that feeling never comes. The mind always has suggestions of another angle to analyze, another scenario to imagine, another replay to execute, and the person interprets those suggestions as evidence that they haven't fully processed it yet. Miles implemented a brutal protocol. After 15 minutes of tactical processing, he verbally declared that the loop was closed, and each time his mind offered a replay, he acknowledged aloud that processing was complete and the loop was closed. He did not negotiate with suggestions from his mind. He did not evaluate whether suggestions seemed valid. He simply acknowledged that the loop was closed by decision and forced attention back to the present. Mind resisted fiercely in the first few days. I would offer perhaps 20 replay suggestions a day, and each suggestion came with persuasive logic about why another replay would be useful. But Miles maintained protocol. He recognized that the loop was closed, and he redirected attention, and gradually the frequency of suggestions decreased, not because mind stopped generating suggestions, but because Miles stopped carefully feeding suggestions. He documented that the critical discovery was understanding that the mind offers rumination not because it is useful, but because it is a habit. The mind had developed a pattern of endlessly replaying failures, and it would continue offering that pattern until it was broken by repeatedly forcing the closure of loops, not by waiting for the mind to voluntarily stop offering rumination. If you're witnessing Sergeant Franklin Miles discover that the mind never voluntarily closes loops, that it needs to force closure through a conscious decision that processing is complete, leave your like now as a soldier who recognizes that you also expect to feel that you have processed enough instead of forcing closure of loops that the mind wants to keep open indefinitely, because upcoming topics will reveal how to apply tactical processing protocol in all areas of life. Miles returned home in October 1945 and discovered that the lesson about processing tactically instead of ruminating wasn't just about military warfare. It was about any context where a person makes a mistake and gets stuck mentally replaying it instead of learning from it and moving on. And in the 67 years after learning the protocol in June 1944, he applied tactical processing to every area of life. 15 minutes to process the failure. Error identified, lesson learned, filed away, and then force. Closure of the loop every time the mind tried to reopen it. He wrote that in 1953, while working in a factory, he made a mistake that cost him an entire day's production. His first reaction was to ruminate. His mind wanted to replay the error indefinitely. But Miles enforced protocol. 15 minutes of tactical processing. The mistake was not checking machine calibration before starting production. The lesson was to add calibration verification to the morning checklist. Filed away. And each time his mind offered a replay of the error, he recognized that processing was complete and forced his attention to the present work. Co-workers processed mistakes completely differently. They ruminated on them for days, and Miles saw the same spiral he had seen in war. Rumination consumed mental energy. The person performed the next task with reduced capacity. They made another mistake, and they had more material to ruminate on. The cycle intensified until the person was operating at perhaps half capacity because half of it was trapped in loops of rumination about multiple accumulated errors. In 1971, when a financial investment failed, losing 2 years' worth of savings, Miles applied the same protocol: 15 minutes of processing. The mistake was investing without fully understanding the risk. The lesson was never to invest in something you didn't understand, even if the opportunity seemed good. Filed away. And he refused to allow his mind to ruminate on lost money for months. He processed it once tactically and moved on. Miles documented that over decades, he saw people around him trapped in cycles of rumination about failures, ruminating about relationships that ended, about businesses that failed, about opportunities they missed. And each person justified rumination by saying they were processing, that they needed to understand, that they couldn't move on until they had fully processed. But they never fully processed because they confused endless rumination with processing. He wrote that the difference between people who learned from failures and people who got stuck was a matter of mental habit. People who learned processed tactically. They identified specific errors, they extracted concrete lessons, they filed them away with conscious decision, and they forced their minds to stop ruminating each time they tried to reopen the loop. People who got stuck ruminated indefinitely. They confused mental activity with learning, and they operated at reduced capacity because significant energy was trapped in replaying the past. In his final years, Miles maintained protocol even for minor mistakes. He said something inappropriate in conversation, 15 minutes of processing, error identified, lesson learned, filed away, and he forced the loop to close. Because he had learned that the size of a mistake didn't matter, what mattered was the mental habit of processing tactically instead of ruminating, and that habit applied to all mistakes regardless of magnitude. In the last decades of his life, Miles wrote that he began to recognize patterns in people around him trapped in cycles of rumination. He saw in their eyes the same spiral that had almost destroyed him in June 1944. People who made mistakes and remained stuck going over them for weeks. And when he saw a pattern, he offered the same brutal lesson that the commander had taught. That rumination is not learning. That processing tactically frees the mind to be present. He described a specific conversation in 1987 with his nephew, who was brooding over a failed work presentation. His nephew had made a mistake that cost him an important contract, and he had been mentally rehearsing the presentation for 2 weeks, saying he needed to understand exactly where he had gone wrong, that he couldn't move forward until he had fully processed it. And Miles recognized why he had thought exactly that way. Miles asked how many times his nephew had replayed the presentation. His nephew estimated maybe 300 times. Miles asked what he had learned in replay number 300 that he didn't know in replay number 10, and his nephew remained silent, because the answer was nothing. The first 10 replays had identified the error and the lesson. The following 290 replays were just emotional rumination, consuming energy that should have been used to prepare for the next opportunity. Miles taught protocol, 15 minutes of tactical processing, specific, error identified, concrete lesson extracted, filed away with a verbal decision that processing was complete, and then, each time the mind offered a replay, acknowledge that the loop was closed and force attention back to the present. Do not negotiate with suggestions from the mind that further analysis would be helpful. Nephew resisted because it seemed cruel to stop processing after only 15 minutes when he had lost an important contract. But Miles explained the brutal math. 2 weeks of rumination had consumed perhaps 40 hours of mental energy, 40 hours where nephew wasn't fully present in his current work. And that mental absence practically guaranteed that the next presentation would be executed with reduced capacity, which would create the risk of another failure, and the cycle would continue. Miles maintained a protocol of teaching tactical processing to anyone he saw stuck in rumination, and each person received the same message, that rumination looks like learning, but is a destructive loop, that true learning extracts lessons and moves on, that the mind never closes loops voluntarily, so you need to force closure through conscious decision, and that the choice between processing tactically and ruminating indefinitely determines whether you learn and improve or remain stuck failing repeatedly. Those who applied the protocol reported transformations. Not because they stopped making mistakes, but because they stopped allowing past mistakes to consume present energy. They processed failures in 15 minutes instead of ruminating for weeks, and they operated with full mental capacity available because zero energy was trapped in loops of rumination about a past they couldn't change. Sergeant Franklin Miles died in August 2011, 67 years after those 2 weeks in June 1944, when he discovered he was trapped in a cycle of failure because he ruminated on failures instead of processing them tactically. He died knowing he had lived the rest of his life applying brutal protocol without exception. 67 years processing failures in 15 minutes. 67 years forcing the closure of mental loops. 67 years operating at full mental capacity because zero energy was tied up, ruminating on a past he couldn't change. When his nephew finished reading the diary hidden in the locked drawer, he finally understood his uncle's transformation. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about changing the relationship with mistakes. Miles had learned that tactically processed mistakes were filed lessons that improved future performance. Ruminated mistakes were mental loops that consumed energy and guaranteed future errors. And the difference between processing and ruminating determined whether a person learned and improved or remained stuck, failing repeatedly. There, sitting in his office with his diary in hand, the nephew realized that Miles's lesson wasn't just about military warfare. It was about recognizing that you're stuck in a cycle of failure right now, that you make mistakes and keep mentally replaying them for days, that you confuse rumination with learning, that you wait to feel you've processed enough before filing it away, and that this mental habit is consuming energy that should be present, ensuring that the next attempt will be executed with reduced capacity. Miles had documented a truth that the Personal Development Society ignores, that most people never learn the distinction between processing tactically and ruminating destructively, that they confuse mental activity with learning, and they get stuck in rumination loops for days or weeks after a failure, wasting energy that should be used to prepare for the next opportunity. Wasted energy guarantees the next failure, and the cycle intensifies until the person is operating at half capacity because half is trapped in an endless replay of multiple accumulated failures. Miles' transformation in June 1944 wasn't about stopping making mistakes. It was about learning to process errors in 15 minutes and forcing loops to close instead of ruminating for weeks. It was about recognizing that the mind never closes loops voluntarily and that it needs a conscious decision that processing is complete. It was about understanding that rumination looks like learning, but is a destructive loop that guarantees future failures. Sergeant Franklin Miles spent 67 years applying a 2-week lesson, and he left a diary not as a war memoir, but as a protocol for those trapped in a cycle of failure, for those who ruminate on mistakes instead of processing them tactically, for those who confuse emotional replay with learning, for those who wait for their mind to signal that it has processed sufficiently instead of forcing the closure of loops. If you listen to this story to the end and recognize that you're stuck ruminating on failures, confusing rumination with learning, operating at reduced capacity because your energy is trapped in endless replay loops, leave a like, subscribe to this channel, and comment below which failure you will tactically process today in 15 minutes instead of ruminating for weeks, because by doing so, you are breaking the cycle that keeps you failing and helping this channel bring more stories of soldiers who discovered how to transform failures into lessons instead of destructive loops. Now tell me, how many hours a day do you waste ruminating on past mistakes instead of processing them tactically in 15 minutes, consuming energy that should be present and guaranteeing the next failure?